Hey guys, Pastor Darvin here, Mission Lakewood Church, coming to you with our Monday, Wednesday, Friday morning devotions. And today we are going to finish looking at some of the events that take place after the resurrection, after Easter morning, that are in the Gospel of John. I've had so much fun looking at these different events, and today we're going to be looking at the reinstatement of Peter. It comes to us from chapter 21 of the Gospel of John. So we'll get started in verse 15, where we're told this: "When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?'" So let's set the scene a little bit, okay? Jesus was arrested, and then he was executed. And in that time between his arrest and his execution, Peter had denied that he had been one of Jesus' disciples 3 times in front of 3 different people. Not Peter's shining moment, right? Like, was really, really struggling. And Jesus had even told him at the Last Supper, hey, this is going to happen. And Peter's like, no. And then it does, right? So if you can imagine that you're Peter and Jesus told you, you're going to deny me 3 times. You're like, no. And then he did deny him 3 times. So like, you've just denied Jesus 3 times. And then you see him die. You give up. And then you see him resurrect. And now you're like, what? You know? But then on the back of your mind, you're thinking, oh, but I messed up. I really messed up. I denied Jesus 3 times. And so there's this gap between Jesus and Peter in the relationship that's going to be needed to be mended. And so how is that gap in that relationship going to be mended? Who is going to bridge the gap between Peter and Jesus over these denials, over the denials that Peter made against Jesus? So Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" So Simon, son of John, I don't know if your mom, when she got mad at you when you were little, or was just really serious, had something serious you need to listen up to, she used your middle name, right? Yeah, that's the only reason I still remember my best buddy from growing up. His name's Clayton Joseph Rhodes. And the only reason I remember his middle name is because his mom would yell at him when we were doing obnoxious things. His mom would yell at him when, she wanted to be serious. Jesus, it's like he's using Peter's middle name almost here. He really wants to get Peter's attention. Be like, hey, you messed up. This is serious. This is a conversation you need to lean in on and really pay attention to. This is some serious stuff. We're going to talk about you messing up now, right? So Jesus says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" So when Jesus says, "Do you love me more than these?" he leaves it almost vague, and I think we have a good guess what he means, but he could mean, do you love me more than these fish? Remember, they're sitting around this meal with fish, and Peter had been a fisherman, so maybe Jesus is asking, do you love me more than these fish, these 153 fish we just caught? Do you love me more than these, Peter? Are you going to go back to your life of fish, or you love me more? I don't think that's what he means, but some commentators will put that out as one of the possibilities. It could also be, Peter, do you love me more than the other disciples love me? And that's a possibility. Or it could be, Peter, do you love me more than you love these other disciples? And I actually think that's probably what Jesus means here. He wants to know, Peter just spent his last 3 years of his life with these guys. I mean, these are his best friends, and Jesus wants to know, do you really love me more than these guys, other than you love these other guys? Do you love me more than anyone else in the world? And I think that's what Jesus is getting at. Like, do you love me more than anything, Peter? "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." So this is really interesting, right? Jesus says, "Do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes." And Jesus says, "Feed my lambs." Now, he's bridging the gap in the relationship. Jesus is doing that. They're sitting around this charcoal fire, and if you look back in John 18, it was around a charcoal fire that was one of the 3 times where Peter denied Jesus. And so it's almost recalling them. It's the same scene, around a fire, getting warm around the fire, getting warm around the fire. And Peter's back in this moment where he denied Jesus, thinking about how he has just denied Jesus. And Jesus is like, "Hey, do you love me?" Peter's like, "Yeah." And Jesus says, "Feed my lambs." And by feed my lambs, he means he wants Peter to to really run the church, to lead the group of followers and lead the other disciples, and to really lead this Jesus movement. That's what he means by feed my lambs. Feed my sheep, right? Verse 16, again Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Right, so he answers a little differently here. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. Verse 17, the third time he said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus said to him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Wouldn't you be hurt in that moment too? I mean, oh man, like, Jesus, he's asking me this 3 times, and Jesus, don't you know that I love you? I know I denied you, but don't you know that I love you? Now, Jesus is not being cruel. We're going to talk about in a few minutes why he asked it 3 times, but he asked this. There's this exchange back and forth between Peter and Jesus, and Peter and Jesus, and Peter and Jesus. Yes, I love you. Yes, I love you. Don't you know that I love you? And then we read this as we continue on in verse 17. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. So Jesus is actually talking about how Peter is going to die. And this was an accurate prophecy, as you would assume from Jesus. The historical church has always claimed that Peter was actually killed, martyred for his faith in Rome, hung upside down on a cross. And so when Jesus says, you will stretch out your hands. You will stretch out your hands. He's talking about, when you're crucified, you actually stretch out your hands to have the nails driven through your hands. So he's prophesying the exact way in which Peter is going to die, which is pretty crazy. He's saying, I'm going to give you this mission to go out and feed my lambs and lead the church, and you're going to die for it. There's a lot of hard things for Peter to process here, right? Like, wait, you're going to ask me this 3 times. I'm offended. Now you're going to tell me I'm going to die to go out and tell other people about you. It's hard stuff. It just is. Verse 19, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. I love that Peter and Jesus, they have this conversation, and then Jesus ends it with this simple phrase, follow me. And it's Jesus' way of saying, okay, I have forgiven you. Not only have I forgiven you, I'm going to use you. And you're going to go out, and you're going to die for it, but you are going to lead my entire movement. I'm about to ascend into heaven. No one's going to physically see me anymore down here on earth, but they're going to see you, Peter, and you're going to be the one to feed my sheep and lead this church and lead this movement. So, what in the world's going on in this passage, right? Because it seems a little brutal. Jesus asked him 3 times. Peter's offended. He's hurt that Jesus asked him 3 times. So why does he ask him 3 times? And then Jesus is like, hey, you're going to die for this. I mean, it's hard stuff. But it's profound. It's profound. Because what it tells us is that even Peter, who had denied Jesus 3 times, it's just awful to do in your faith, right? Even Peter was forgiven and used by God. I mean, Peter, can you imagine the guilt he was feeling as this began? And yet he was forgiven and used by Jesus in this scene. Jesus is saying, all right, let's get past this. Let's get past this denial thing. I forgive you, and now here's how you're going to be used. You're going to lead my church. You're going to feed my sheep. So here's a few interesting things about that is that Jesus, he bridges the gap between Peter and him. And one of the interesting things that we see here is that, of course, there's 3 times that Peter denied Jesus, and then there are 3 times that Jesus reinstates Peter. So 3 times Peter had denied Jesus in John 18, and then Jesus in this scene 3 times says, do you love me? It's almost like Peter, I want you to understand, I really forgive you. I know you're gonna regret that the rest of your life that you denied me 3 times, but I want you to know and remember that you also said you loved me 3 times. to counterbalance, to counterweight that guilt you're going to feel because you're forgiven and I love you. You know how to deal with that, right? And then one of the other interesting things is the language that Jesus and Peter use here. Now you can kind of over-exaggerate the importance of the words that are used because, of course, Jesus wasn't speaking in Greek. He was speaking Aramaic. But in the Greek words that we have recorded by John, we actually see two different words for the word love. The English language is very limited in its ability to express love. It's just the one word, but of course there's tons in other languages, and in Greek there's tons, and the two that are used in this passage are phileo and agape. And so phileo is a more human, lowly love. Agape is a more divine, unconditional love. And it's interesting because, so there's these three times Jesus says, "Do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes, you know that I love you." Well, the first time Jesus says, "Do you agape me?" Do you agape me? That's that higher love. And Peter says, "Yes, I phileo you." And then Jesus the second time says, "Do you agape me?" And then Peter says, "Yes, I phileo you." But the third time Jesus says, "Do you phileo me?" And Peter says, "Yes, I phileo you." And so the idea here, very subtle in the language, and we don't want to make too much out of it, was almost that John's trying to bring out into the language that he chose to translate this into, that Jesus is saying, "Do you have that high, unconditional love for me?" And Peter's like, "Oh, I want to be there, but I'm not quite. I love you, but it's a little bit lower than that." And then he asks it again that way. And then the third time, Jesus bridges the gap between him and Peter and is like, "Okay, do you humanly love me? Do you love me the best phileo of your ability?" And Peter says, "Yes." So it's an interesting little contrast in language where Jesus is just doing everything he can to forgive Peter and bridge the gap between him and Peter. So he's totally forgiven, and then he gets this mission to be used by God. And he's going to be the leader of the first church. What an incredible honor. And Jesus is instilling this on him, and the other disciples are going to know about it, and they're going to know that Peter's their leader. And you know what? Peter, he went and did this. In the book of Acts, we see him leading the church. Not perfectly by a long shot, but he leads the church. He writes some books in the Bible, and he does all these amazing things, bring the kingdom of God out to the people. And then later church history tells us that he does die in Rome, just as Jesus tells us here. And to this day, if you visit Rome, you can go to the Vatican. You see the Peter's Basilica that was built way later during the Renaissance, but is built over where a lot of people in church history believe that Peter was actually crucified upside down, just like here, Jesus predicted. And so the whole point of this passage is that he's forgiving and using Peter. So even though Peter had done this horrible thing in denying him, even though Peter could have dealt with guilt the rest of his life, and just really struggled, as they looked back at his past and remember those 3 times of denial, that could have been a struggle the rest of his life. But Jesus forgives him. And not only does he forgive him, he says, "I'm going to give you this huge, amazing mission. You're going to lead my church." So he forgives him and he uses him. So this is the message for us today. We all struggle with stuff with our past, right? We all struggle with feeling guilt over the ways that we've messed up. Maybe we didn't deny God. Maybe we messed up in some other big way or some sin, or maybe we did stray from faith and come back. Maybe we had issues with whatever it is for you, right? You have those moments in your head. And on our worst days, we can kind of relive those moments and just feel this guilt, and it can just kind of feel like it's crushing us. And I think had Peter not had this moment around that fire with Jesus, I think he would have really been crushed by that guilt of denying him. Just like we can be crushed by our own guilt over the stuff we've done, the ways we've messed up in the past. But Jesus' message to you today is you are forgiven, and he wants to use you. whatever that stuff is that you struggle with guilt over, you are forgiven by the blood of the Lamb, if you're forgiven by Jesus, if you believe in him. And not only that, not only you're forgiven, he wants to use you. He wants to use you in a big, big way. So today, think about those things that you often struggle with guilt. Realize you have been forgiven. And I want you to think about and imagine how God now wants to use you, right? As he sends you out into the world, just like Jesus sent Peter out into the world after he had forgiven him during these 3 denials and these 3 reinstatements. Thanks for being with us in our Monday, Wednesday, Friday devotions. God bless.